Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's wrap up week 39 with Second Age Saturday. Now, this series, we've been reading about the adventures of Aldarion from Unfinished Tales. Let's pick up where we left off last week, as Aldarion snuck out of the house, or island as the case may be, with his buddies, even though his dad grounded him. At the open rebellion of Aldarion, the king rescinded his authority as lord of the ships and havens of Numenor, and he caused the guild house of the Venturers on Eambar to be shut, and the shipyards of Ramenna to be closed, and forbade the felling of all trees for shipbuilding. 5 years passed, and Aldarion returned with 9 ships, for 2 had been built in Vinalonde, and they were laden with fine timber from the forests of the coasts of Middle-earth. The anger of Aldarion was great when he found what had been done, and to his father he said, "If I am to have no welcome in Numenor, and no work for my hands to do, and if my ships may not be repaired in its havens, then I will go again and soon, for the winds have been rough, and I need refitment. Has not a king's son aught to do but study women's faces to find a wife? The work of forestry I took up, and I have been prudent in it. There will be more timber in Numenor ere my day ends than there is under your scepter." And true to his word, Aldarion left again in the same year with 3 ships and the hardiest of the Venturers, going without blessing or bow, for Meneldor set a ban on all the women of his house and of the Venturers, and put a guard about Ramenna. On that voyage, Aldarion was away so long that the people feared for him, and Meneldor himself was disquieted, despite the grace of the Valar that had ever protected the ships of Numenor. When 10 years were gone since his sailing, Erendis at last despaired, and believing that Aldarion had met with disaster, or else that he had determined to dwell in Middle-earth, and also in order to escape the importuning of suitors, she asked the queen's leave, and departing from Armenolos, she returned to her own kindred in the Westlands. But after 4 years more, Aldarion at last returned, and his ships were battered and broken by the seas. He had sailed first to the haven of Vinalonde, and thence he had made a great coastwise journey southwards, far beyond any place yet reached by the ships of the Numenorians. But returning northwards, he had met contrary winds and great storms, and scarce escaping shipwreck in the Harad, found Vinalonde overthrown by great seas and plundered by hostile men. 3 times he was driven back from the crossing of the great sea by high winds out of the west, and his own ship was struck by lightning and dismasted, and only with labor and hardship in the deep waters did he come at last to haven in Numenor. Greatly was Meneldor comforted at Aldarion's return, but he rebuked him for his rebellion against king and father, thus forsaking the guardianship of the Valar, and risking the wrath of Osse, not only for himself, but for men whom he had bound to himself in devotion. Then Aldarion was chastened in mood, and he received the pardon of Meneldor, who restored to him the lordship of the ships and havens, and added thereto the title of Master of the Forests. Aldarion was grieved to find Erendis gone from Armenolos, but he was too proud to seek her, and indeed he could not well do so, save to ask for her in marriage, and he was still unwilling to be bound. He set himself to the repairing of the neglects of his long absence, for he had been nigh on 20 years away, and at that time great harbor works were put in hand, especially at Ramenna. He found that there had been much felling of trees for building and the making of many things, but all was done without foresight, and little had been planted to replace what was taken, and he journeyed far and wide in Numenor to view the standing woods. So we start with Meneldor taking away Aldarion's phone, TV, and car, or in Second Age terms, revoking his position as the lord of the ships, shutting down the guild house, closing the shipyards, and forbidding the cutting down of any trees to build ships. But when he comes back 5 years later with 2 more ships than he left with, Aldarion was ticked and ready to leave again immediately, so he does, this time with a much smaller crew, just the hardiest of the Venturers and only 3 ships. And then in a moment of foreboding, he leaves without the blessing of the green bough of return. 10 years later, so he's only been in Numenor for less than 1 year in the last 15, he's still gone, and even his dad is worried. And if Meneldor is worried, Erendis is filled with despair. Either he's dead or he's living in Middle-earth. So she goes back home. Now, 4 years later, after a 14-year journey, Aldarion shows up, but it was a rough trip. Now, he'd started at Vignalande and then he went south, far, far south, beyond where any Numenorians had ever gone. Got to know how far that is, really. I want to know. But when he came back, well, Vignalande was a wreck. Now, it wouldn't be the last time this haven would be overthrown, but that's a story for another episode as we talk about Lond Dire. That's the name that it would be called later. Now, eventually, Aldarion does make it back to Numenor, but not without struggles. His dad, the king, happy to see him, but still gave him what for, pointing out that he'd risked Osse's wrath and that it wasn't just himself that he was risking. And maybe, just maybe, this seems to have gotten through to him a bit, and his position was restored after he repented, and he even got a new title, Master of the Forest, and it does seem like that's something he's rather good at. He does seem to have a little bit of foresight in knowing how to do forest management. But Erendis was gone, and Aldarion still not willing to commit, still after decades now. So he didn't look for her. Instead, he focuses on his reforestation projects after 2 decades of indiscriminate felling of trees. For now, though, folks, that does it for this week's Second Age Saturday. Now, thank you for joining me, and please come back next week as Aldarion spots a familiar face in the forests and Erendis names her foe. Please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, join my content council, get a bonus episode each week, and more. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, like and subscribe. Otherwise, follow or subscribe in your podcast apps. And everybody, please follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.